Hello, government students. This is a lecture on Lesson 3 and is part of Learning Module 4. Learning Module 4 will cover all of Lesson 3, and it is about the one topic, and that's federalism. This is something that a topic that we introduced in Learning Module 3 with Lesson 2, and we're going to dig deeper into that topic for this lesson. These are the objectives that you should be able to accomplish at the end of Lesson 3. We'll start out by just reviewing essentially the way the way America's government shifted a bit during the Revolutionary War era and the few decade or the first decade after it. So if you think about before the Revolutionary War, we were colonies of Great Britain. And Great Britain's government system was known as a unitary system. So that's here on this graphic. This is just a graphic representation of the different systems of government that have occurred in the United States of America. So as colonies, we were part of a unitary system. And in a unitary system, all power is derived from a strong centralized national government. So that would have been, in our case, as colonies, the British national government, King George and Parliament. And that power then will be passed down from the central government or the national government to state and local governments. That's how a unitary system works. It's very top down. After the American, or really during the American Revolution, this is when our founding fathers got together. We declared our independence and we wrote our first governing document, something we covered in Lesson 2, the Articles of Confederation. And so at that point in time, under the Articles of Confederation, we had shifted to this system of government, a confederation, which we defined in our last lesson as just a very decentralized form of government. We were just a union of 13 states kind of coming together in a league of friendship for a very limited purpose, which was essentially to fight the Revolutionary War and act on behalf of the states on the world stage. So we empowered our central government to send diplomats to other countries, to enlist foreign aid, money, and soldiers to help us fight the war. Then after the war, we used the central government to negotiate trade agreements and deal with other foreign countries. But that confederation gave such little power to the national government that it didn't work well. And we saw many problems in it that we have gone over in our strength and weakness pro-con list in the last lesson. But just to emphasize, in a confederation, the source of the national government's power are the states, not the people. So as we looked at the very first article in the Articles of Confederation, it made it very clear that we were a union of states coming together to form a national government for that limited purpose that I mentioned a second ago. But again, because of all the problems with the Articles of Confederation, we decided to start all over again with a very new constitution, and we formed this system of government known as a federation or a federal system of government. And that's that's what we have now. So we've gone through three different systems of government in American history. And that fact that we've moved back and forth is going to be relevant to us a lot later. At the very end of the lecture, I'll kind of circle back to that shift between these different government systems and how it kind of plays a role in American federalism. But back to the point, we are still a federation. We operate as a federal system of government. And a federal system of government has certain specific characteristics, one of which you can see in this graphic, where the source of all government power is the people. And that's one of the reasons why you saw in the preamble of the US Constitution, it starts out, "We, the people of the United States, form a more perfect union." So now we are not just a union of states, we are a union of people forming a national government. So we have a direct relationship with a national government. We didn't do away with our state governments. The people also have a direct relationship with their state governments. So now we have two different layers or levels of government, and that's what makes up a federal system, or one of the things that makes up a federal system. So that's one of the characteristics of federalism or a federal system. Federalism refers to the balance of power between the national and subnational levels of government. That's what we talked about last lesson. But now we're going to focus on the specific characteristics of American federalism. The one I just mentioned, popular sovereignty. The people are the source of government power, and we form both levels of government, a national and a subnational level. And those two government systems, the state and the nation, have their own realm or jurisdiction, areas of public policy that they are responsible for. And I'll demonstrate that. I'm going to flip to, I'll come back to these points, but I'm flipping to the next slide to make a point. As far as the realms or jurisdictions of each level of government, we have one of the Federalist Papers that describes it pretty well, and that's why I've got this up here. This is not one we're reading for the class, Federalist number 45. And in it, James Madison describes the realms or jurisdictions of the two different levels of government. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those are very important words to remember. The national government's powers were few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. So he's essentially saying that the Constitution sets up a very limited national government and leaves state governments all other powers that are not given to the national government. Now he goes further. The former, referring to the national government, will be exercised principally on external objects, so matters of national concern, such as war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce, with which the last power of taxation will, for the most part, be connected. So the business of the national government are national affairs, national and international affairs. So they are few and defined. Now we go to the state government. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which, in the ordinary course of affairs, concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. So all other powers not given to the national government are reserved to, see the word reserved, to the states, and will typically involve everyday matters. And everyday matters concern most public policy. Most public policy is about everyday life, peacetime life. And so that's what Madison's next point is. The operations of the federal government will be most extensive and important in times of war and danger. Those of the state governments in times of peace and security. So he's expecting, and all the founding fathers were expecting, the national government to be active during times of war and state governments to be active in times of peace. They expected the national government to have very little involvement in the everyday lives of its citizens. So that's what we're talking about when we're referring to these realms or jurisdictions that the state government and the national government each have. They each have their own little areas where they operate. Our second characteristic is the existence of a written national constitution, and that we've covered. We've also talked about this attribute, separation of powers, but I make the point here that separation occurs at each level. So, yes, as you're aware, we separated the powers of our national government between a legislative, executive, and judicial branch. But that is also true of state governments. There is a legislative, executive, and judicial branch at the state level. You have a state legislature. The state of South Carolina has its own legislature. You have a state executive power, whom we call the governor or the office of the governor. And then you have a judicial branch. You have state courts. So that separation of powers, even the checks and balances, they exist at both levels of government. The fourth attribute is that we use courts to resolve disputes between the levels of government. And in this lesson, in this learning module, you're going to see examples of several different U.S. Supreme Court cases where the court is having to decide whether the national government has overstepped its jurisdiction or its authority, or whether the state governments have. So those disputes between who's got power to do what, national or state government, is decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. The last attribute is that state governments would be represented in one chamber of the national legislature. And that is seen in our nation in the Senate. So we have a bicameral legislature. We've discussed that. There's a Senate and a House of Representatives. And those are two separate groups of people. There's no overlap between the people who serve in the Senate and the people who serve in the House. The Senate is deemed to be the representation of each state or each state's government. And that's why originally the people who elected the senators were the state legislatures. The citizens of the states, there was no popular election for senators until within the past 100 years. At the time the Constitution was written, state legislatures chose the senators, and that gave state legislatures a platform in the national government. That has changed a bit, and it's something that we'll study more about later. But those are the 5 characteristics of American federalism. And all the rest of the material in this lesson, in this learning module, are about one or more of those characteristics. You'll see examples of them in everything else we do with this learning module. So we'll focus next on exactly how the U.S. Constitution supports American federalism. And we're going to start with national powers. How does the Constitution support federalism in the national government? Well, it does that by enumerating the powers of the national government. The Constitution lists them specifically. Each branch of government is established by an article of the U.S. Constitution, and its powers are clearly defined and limited to a list in that article. So, for example, Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, when we outlined it, you saw this, it established the legislative branch. And in Article 1, Section 8, the powers of the legislative branch are outlined. They're specifically listed. So you would see there that Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, to declare war, to establish a court system, to regulate commerce among the several states, to control immigration and conduct foreign relations, to coin money. So there's a long list, but they are enumerated specifically, exactly what Congress has the power to do. Section 8 also includes at the very end of that list something we call the elastic clause, where it says that Congress shall have the power to enact laws that are necessary and proper for carrying into execution the above listed powers. And that seems sort of open-ended. And we do consider this language, the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause, we consider it the source of the doctrine of implied powers. that in addition to that list of enumerated powers, Congress can do these other implied things, or has the implied power to do these other things. But it really isn't open-ended, because the elastic clause includes that phrase, necessary to carry out the enumerated powers, the ones listed above it. So there has to be a connection to an enumerated power. And let me just give an example of that. So one of the enumerated powers in Section 8 is the power of Congress to establish and support an army and a navy. All right, great. So they can establish a national army and navy, right? Land powers, naval powers, or sea powers, I guess would be the word. So at that time, we didn't have airplanes. So that's why it doesn't say that Congress has the power to establish and support an air force. But it's implied, once we had that technology, once we had planes and we needed a military force in the air, it's implied that Congress can support and establish an air force. It's implied by the existence of the power to establish an army and a navy. So that's just an example. It's not as open-ended as it sounds, because you have to, every law that Congress passed has to be connected back to an enumerated power, whether it's a specific match or it's implied by one of the listed powers. Still has to have that connection. So it's still limited and not open-ended. A constitution also prevents the national government from abusing its power in certain specific ways. And an example of that, as far as Congress is concerned, in Article 1, again, we're dealing with the article that establishes the legislative branch. Section 9 of that article denies the federal government certain specific powers, including, we'll go over them more later, but just to kind of give you the list, it prevents the Congress from passing bills of attainder, ex post facto laws, from suspending the writ of habeas corpus. And those are just a few examples. It also provides for a jury trial. I mean, there are different protections that are protections from abuse of power that are provided in the original Constitution. It also goes further at limiting Congress's power in the Bill of Rights. We often jump to the Bill of Rights when we think about, oh, those are our freedoms and civil liberties, and that's true. But the Bill of Rights was enacted and ratified in order to limit Congress's power, or limit the powers of the national government. So you have at least those two sources of limitation on power that are provided by the U.S. Constitution. And so that's one of the attributes of a federal system, is that you have this written constitution that defines and limits the power of the national government. And these are just examples of how that actually works. Now, as far as state governments go, the U.S. Constitution does not create the state governments. States have and always had their own state constitutions that set up their government. So that you won't look to the U.S. Constitution for the formation of state governments. They already existed when the national government was formed. States came first, so state constitutions came first. And in those state constitutions, you'll see a lot of similarities to our national Constitution, because the national Constitution was kind of built off of those state constitutions. We use the state constitutions as models for the U.S. Constitution. But the U.S. Constitution does contemplate the existence of state governments and provide some measures for their interaction between the different levels. So, for example, something that may be familiar to you, one of the Bill of Rights is the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment reserves powers to the state governments. So it says all powers not herein delegated to the national government are reserved to the state governments or the people, as the case may be. That is known as reserve powers. And you see that in the 10th Amendment. So it's acknowledging the existence of state governments and the fact that state governments have their own realm of jurisdiction, their own power. The U.S. Constitution also gives or recognizes that states have the power to designate electors for electing the president and for controlling the process for electing members of Congress. I don't have that in the PowerPoint slide, but that is a power that state governments are given or by the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution also denies certain powers to the state government. So here's where the founding fathers just made a choice that there are certain things we are giving to the national government to do, and we herein are specifically denying the state governments the power to do those things. So, for example, state governments can't coin their own money. State governments are not permitted to enter into treaties with other nations. State governments cannot institute tariffs. They can't start wars. Those types of things are prohibited from the state governments. But it also includes additional restrictions in Section 10 of Article 1 that are similar to the restrictions on the national government powers about bills of attainder, ex post facto laws. Those limitations are really protections of individual citizens are put in place in Article 1, Section 10. And then last, the Reconstruction Amendments also limit state government power. That is, those amendments were passed after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and they were intended to protect the liberties of former slaves and African Americans. So the Constitution then recognizes the existence of state governments, recognizes that they hold reserve powers. It also specifically denies state governments certain powers, certain specific powers that I've gone through, and protects the civil liberties of citizens against abuses of power by the state government. Any disputes between two or more states are to be resolved by the federal judiciary. That's provided in Article 3. Article 4 governs the relationship between the states. I believe we went over that real briefly when we were outlining the Constitution, but I'll mention them again. It provides the full faith and credit clause, meaning that each state must recognize and uphold the laws of other states. The next was the comity clause, that each state must ensure the privileges and immunities of other citizens. So one state cannot discriminate against the citizens of another state. So you may be currently in South Carolina attending Lander University, but yet not an actual citizen of South Carolina. You may be a citizen of another state who's just come here to attend college. But South Carolina has to extend the same privileges and immunities to you, regardless of what state you're actually a citizen of. That's known as the Privileges and Immunities Clause, or the Comity Clause. That's in Article 4 there. Article 4 also provides for interstate compacts. So two or more states can enter into a contract or an agreement with one another. And an example of that would be water usage out west. Several states have entered into agreements on access, for example, to the Colorado River that it crosses through several states. So the Constitution is going to back up those agreements. The last measure that the Constitution applies when we're talking about the relationship between the states and American federalism is the Supremacy Clause. And this is in Article 6 of the Constitution. In Article 6, the Constitution makes clear that when Congress passes a law validly, like that's within the scope of its authority provided by the Constitution. Congress's laws are supreme to state laws. So states may legislate in some of the same areas that the Congress, the national government, has legislated, but in the end, the national government's laws will preempt state laws, will have authority over state laws. So state laws can't contradict national laws on the same subject. Here, let me show you the example I've got here. So you see in the funny little graphic that there's, the guy from California who's got the joint, right? So he's smoking marijuana. So there are certain states that allow the use of medical marijuana or recreational use nowadays of marijuana. But the national government also has enacted laws regarding drug use. And as far as our national government is concerned, marijuana is a controlled substance. So the federal government, the DEA, specifically could arrest and prosecute someone for using marijuana, even though state governments may authorize it and may have made it not a crime to use marijuana. So there's a direct conflict between the national laws and state laws on the use of medical marijuana. Technically, national laws preempt those state laws, but just for a variety of reasons, Congress has simply chosen not to enforce the marijuana laws and have allowed state laws to contradict it. But technically, they're not supposed to. Technically, our federal laws regarding marijuana usage would preempt the state laws because of the supremacy clause. There are some powers, I talked about how the national government and the state governments would have their own realms of jurisdiction, powers that they were specifically in charge of, or areas of public policy that they're in charge of. And so the chart that you should now see on your on the screen is an outline of powers, the enumerated powers of Congress, such as coining money, regulating foreign commerce, immigration and naturalization. Those types of things are very much so within the realm of the national government's power. Over here to the right, the reserve powers of the states, they typically involve what we would call police powers. So powers involving the welfare of individual citizens in their everyday lives. And this should kind of remind you of those quotes I had from Federalist Paper 45, where James Madison is kind of describing the various realms of jurisdiction of the national government and the state governments. So that's what this is sort of outlining. But you see in the middle, there are concurrent powers where there is an overlap. So if this was a Venn diagram, here would be the overlap between the two circles. These are known as concurrent powers. Both levels of government can lay and collect taxes, both can borrow money, both can make laws, both can have court systems, that sort of thing. So you have powers that are specific to the levels of government, and then you have powers that are held concurrently. And we're going to next look at this one particular concurrent power, and that is lay and collect taxes. So our next slide here is focused on the taxing power of the national government. Article 1, Section 8 grants Congress the power to tax. But if you read further in Section 9, this has changed, but it used to restrict Congress's ability to tax citizens directly. It made it so Congress could ask states to support the national government by paying taxes, and the state's portion of that tax burden would be determined by the population. And so that meant that required a census at the state level to determine the population of each state. And then they could kind of argue about their share of what they had to give over to the national government in the form of taxation. So you can see how that got to be a problematic. It made it very difficult to get any sort of taxation on income of the citizens in the various states. It was just complicated and it was a deterrent. So originally, most of the national government's revenue came from the sale of land. So you remember historically in the late 1700s, there was a lot of unsettled territory. And so the national government was able to sell land to states or abroad to other countries, and it could derive some revenue from that practice. It would also, of course, derive revenue from international trade with other countries. So that's where most of the money that funded the operation of the national government allowed it to legislate in all these areas. The national government couldn't do all these things if it wasn't taxing and having that revenue to fund these operations, these enumerated powers. Um, and so that meant that to start out with, our national government was not very active except in times of war. Um, so most of the time, it wasn't doing very much early in American history. In the early 1900s, that all changed. For a variety of reasons, there was a great demand for the national government to get more involved, more active in public policy. So Congress enacted and the states ratified the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and that allowed the national government to start directly taxing citizens. So it could then, and in going forward, impose an income tax on citizens. And now, if you look, I've got some graphics on here, and I'm sorry the words are kind of small. I'll just kind of tell you we're here, total revenues. This is currently, or 2023 is the most recent data I could get. This is from the Congressional Budget Office. The amount of revenue that our national government takes in, about half of it comes from income tax. So that 16th Amendment authorized the national government to derive a huge source of revenue from income taxation. That's this green line here. In addition to income taxes, the national government draws taxation through payroll. So this would be something your employers pay. You would not. Employers will pay a payroll tax to the national government. There's also certain corporate taxes, but actually a tiny fraction of taxation is on big companies. Most of it's on regular people like us. We bear most of the tax burden of our national government still. And then there's some kind of miscellaneous sources of revenue right there reflected in this graphic here. So that's $4.4 trillion was the revenue in 2023 of our national government. And that's what that bullet point is about. Now, as far as spending goes, now we're up here to the outlays. And again, this is from the Congressional Budget Office. You can go there on the internet to look at this. It's actually an interactive graphic where you can kind of play around and study this. But you see that the spending of the national government goes mostly to these cooperative programs, Medicare and Medicaid. The national and state governments work together in funding those two programs. Then this chunk here is Social Security. So payments that people receive from the national government during their retirement is known as Social Security. So it kicks in when you're in your mid 60s, and the national government sends you a check every month to support you when you're no longer really fit to work full time. There's other spending that is done on a discretionary level that Congress will determine year to year. This chunk refers to military spending, and this is non-military spending. And this is net interest. And now we're getting a little more complicated than our class has to be. But I just wanted you to see the graphics and kind of look at how our national government, where it gets its money from and where it sends its money. We'll look at it also for state governments just a second. the revenue state governments use, they have not been restricted in their ability to tax citizens. So a good portion of the revenue at a state government comes from income taxation on citizens. So you pay an income tax to the national government and to your state governments. States also, however, tax citizens on the sales. So that's when you go shopping, you buy something, you look at your receipt, you'll see sales tax at the bottom of it. That's another source of taxation, but that goes to state governments, not the national government. States also tax property, so that would be real estate and personal property like cars. And at least a quarter, most of the time, even more than just a quarter of a state revenue actually comes from the national government in the form of grants. So a grant is like an outlay of money coming from the national government down to the state governments. It's a pass through. So this money that we pay into our national government here, a good portion of it is spent on these, I refer to them as cooperative programs. These are grant programs where the national government gives this money to the states, and then the states go about implementing the program and spending the money. This is a map here that shows the percentage of state revenue that each state in the U.S. derives from the national government. You see South Carolina here. 36.5% of South Carolina's revenue comes from the national government. It's like a pass through. So it comes from the national government down to South Carolina and becomes part of South Carolina's budget that it then goes to spend. And on this graphic, you see how South Carolina divvies up its spending. Unfortunately, this data is extremely old. Look at that, 2014. But it is actually the most recent data I could get, at least in the form of a pie chart. So I chose to use this even though it's old. It hasn't changed that much. But you see, this is spending by state government on education, your college education, higher ed. So this is K through 12. This is college education, public assistance programs, Medicaid, corrections, our prisons, and transportation, our roads, and other, that would include pretty much everything else. That's how state governments are spending the money that they receive, either from taxing citizens and property or from federal grants. Okay, so this chart here is intended to show you the fluctuation in the national government's budget because, and I'm showing you this for a reason. When you look at any government, national or state, when you look at their budgets, the amount of their revenue, the amount of their spending, you can see what their powers are and when they are active and when they're not active in public policy. So this is a chart showing the national government's budget over the course of American history, going all the way back to 1790, and even as it's predicted through to 2050. And you'll see that starting out in American history, it's pretty flat there. So this is like for the first 80 years, national government wasn't that active, wasn't doing so much. Here's a little bump. That's the War of 1812. Remember, national governments are more active during times of war. So slight increase in the budget and the spending right there, but mostly pretty low key. That changes here. You see a big bump in spending. What's happening in the early 1860s? The Civil War. So you see more activity in the national government at that time period. Goes back down. We rock along for a while. Early 1900s, another spike. What's happening then? World War I. So again, in times of war, as predicted by James Madison in the Federalist paper, in times of war, the national government is more active. It will be spending more. It will be more involved in the public policies of the nation. But even after, so it drops back down after World War I, but beyond that, you see this steady climb. Now, a huge spike happens. That's World War II. But focus here on this steady increase in spending. There is a change, a shift, a marked shift in American federalism right here in this time period. And that's what the rest of this lesson is about, how American federalism changed. What I've just described to you is how the Constitution works and supports those 5 different characteristics of American federalism. But now we've got to look at the way American federalism has changed over time. The federal system that was established in our Constitution, coupled with other attributes of American history and its people, set up a struggle for power or control between the 2 levels of government. So, like a tug of war that you see here demonstrated in this graphic. Remember at the beginning of this lecture where I was talking about how the American system of government shifted from a unitary system when we were colonies under Great Britain to a confederation when we were just a union of 13 separate states to a federation where we become a nation of people. So citizens, popular sovereignty, we, the people, set up a national government and have that direct relationship. But when we did that, and when we divided our government powers into those 2 levels, so that's what federalism is, that balance of power between the national government and the state government. When we did that, we set the stage for a tug of war in power. So the courts have had to decide, okay, at this point in time, the national government has the power to do this, or at this point in time, the state governments have the power here. You'll see this tension or tug of war acting upon American history, starting at its very beginning and continuing to present day. Many of the events that occurred over the course of American history reflect this tension, and they have led to this change, to several changes. And those changes have been categorized by political scientists into 4 different types of federalism: dual federalism, cooperative federalism, new federalism, and competitive federalism. So those are 4 different types of American federalism that have existed over the course of our history. And the rest of this learning module is going to focus on those 4 types and just the way federalism has changed over time due to various events and changes in American history. But instead of me lecturing on all of those, for this learning module, you get to do the job of sort of presenting and teaching one another about these 4 areas or 4 types of federalism. So now that you've heard this lecture, your first job then is to go read chapter 3 in our online textbook. And I mean, study it. Don't just skim over it. Read it very carefully. And particularly, you're going to focus on these 4 types of federalism. And so your learning module includes an assignment for you to study that chapter and answer questions, write out your answers to the questions regarding these 4 different types of federalism. And then you each get assigned one of these types, and you'll create your own PowerPoint presentation on that one type. So you're answering questions about all 4 types, but then you're going to take the information you learn from answering those questions and really study it well enough that you can teach it to one another through creating your own PowerPoint or Google Slides presentation on that one type of federalism. So that's what you should do next. You go back and look at the learning module, see what the assignments are, but your very next task is to go and study chapter 3. If you have questions about any of the material that I've gone over to introduce federalism, of course, you email me, or any questions about those assignments, email me. I'm here to help.